Of the many anime tropes and archetypes that characters ultimately end up falling into, the Tsundere is easily the most well known. Examples of Tsundere characters and their various traits can be seen all over anime, and even going back to the 80s you can see a lot of characters exhibiting these traits. The trope wouldn't hit its peak until the 2000s, however, with almost a literal flood of Tsundere-type characters, whether male or female, appearing in nearly every show that aired. It's 2025 now, and while the Tsundere archetype is still ever present, it certainly lost a lot of its popularity in the years since then. It's not hard to find someone who utterly despises the trope, and many others who regard it with exhaustion or ambivalence. Personally, I find a lot of these complaints range from somewhat warranted to completely missing the mark. But even I couldn't deny that it's easy to forget why the trope was so appealing in the first place. Before we can talk about what makes a good or bad tsundere, we have to talk about what a tsundere even is in the first place. I know even the most casual anime fans already have their own ideas, but it's always good to go back to a concept's origin and see how it evolved over time. The tsundere character is classically described as a love interest that is harsh or cold in the beginning, but slowly becomes sweeter and more affectionate as they grow closer. Over time, it's come to describe characters that sometimes waffle between the two moods, and even gets applied to non-romantic relationships as well. Despite being a rather prominent trope in anime, the concept of tsundere actually originates in visual novels, particularly in dating sims that naturally had romance options of all kinds. Wikipedia credits Kimi ga Nozomu Eien as the one to popularize the term. But there have clearly been many anime characters that appeared before this game's release that exhibited the proper traits. The earliest example is Lum from Urusei Yatsura, though she actually acts quite different from what modern anime fans would consider tsundere behavior. Many tsundere characters tend to hide their feelings from their respective love interests, but Lum is always open with her affections for Utaru. When he rejects her advances, however, she immediately switches over to fury and amps up the voltage. Lum does fulfill the dual interplay of harsh and sweet that the archetype demands, though definitely in a very different way from most modern tsunderes. Other more classic tsundere characters veer a little bit closer to the standard character progression that I described previously, though the trope itself hadn't really been identified yet. Once the guidelines began to form though, it was almost like a dam broke. Tsundere characters suddenly began appearing in all sorts of anime, as if it was somehow a magic spell that gave their series that extra pizzazz. Over time, that archetype began to coalesce, and a sort of formula began to put itself together. You know the usual quotes. "It's not like I did it for you, okay? Don't misunderstand." And the ever-present, always versatile, baka. The tsundere character became a cliche, and though I consider myself to be a based tsundere enjoyer, I can't deny that a lot of characters do fall into that trap. Despite this, the tsundere archetype remained popular, and even after its peak remains omnipresent in anime. Because of that, it's hard to be surprised that the archetype ends up facing a lot of scorn and derision. Every trope has its detractors, and with tsundere characters being so common even now, it's no wonder it gets a lot of flack. Even so, I often feel that a lot of vitriol flung at tsunderes is a little overstated. A lot of criticism aimed at tsunderes often stems from strongly misunderstanding the archetype's purpose, whether unintentional or otherwise. Tsundere characters often get called crazy or psycho and generalized as being unreasonable and unpredictable mood swingers. It's a little unfair, but unfortunately, the archetype has been so flanderized nowadays that such descriptions aren't far from the truth. Then there's the violence, which I think gets lumped in with the tsundere archetype pretty unanimously at this point. While it's clearly meant to be a way to insert physical comedy, it often gets overused, and is a big part of why tsunderes are so disliked nowadays. Having said that, I think the way some critics like to reframe all of that as abusive is just bad faith, though it doesn't exactly feel that way whenever a particular tsundere takes it way over the line. There's still an appeal to the tsundere archetype though, and it's in that appeal that makes these characters so interesting. For an example, let's look at one of the most influential characters in advancing the trope, Asuka Langley Soryu from Neon Genesis Evangelion. Asuka's first impression, whether it be to her eventual love interest Shinji Ikari or the audience, is that of a rather belligerent and haughty young girl. As we peel back the layers of her personality, however, we slowly discover a tragic, broken soul, one desperate to find comfort wherever she can. Now, Evangelion is not a story that dwells much on romance, but it is there, and Asuka's relationship with Shinji does occasionally take center stage. Most of her interactions with him are rather harsh, almost to the point of bullying. Over time though, she slowly begins to care for him in her own way. Despite this, she can't properly articulate these feelings, partly because of her own personality, but also because of how her relationship with Shinji has been. As a result, she continues to treat him as she always does, even though she treats Kaji, a character she also has feelings for, with a much sweeter demeanor. Evangelion being what it is, Asuka never really gets much in the way of a resolution when it comes to this matter, but it's pretty clear to anyone watching what's going on here. We should remember that despite being one of the first names to come up whenever someone talks about Tsunderes, Asuka herself arrived before the concept was even all that popular. Characters like her had appeared before, of course, but those traits had yet to be calcified into the archetype we know today. Her actions, her behaviors, and the state of her relationships are the way they are because of her personality, not because there's an archetype that needs to be fulfilled. Now personally, Asuka is far from my favorite character, even when we're sticking to Tsunderes, and even I can't deny she can sometimes cross the line. However, that doesn't make her portrayal any less effective. With a lot of modern Tsunderes, it's often the opposite. Rather than their personality naturally causing them to act like a tsundere, their personality is instead a justification to make them play the archetype. With tsundere types often being abrasive and thorny at first glance, this only makes them an easier target for derision. Add to that the boundless popularity the trope has, and the exhaustion that accompanies it, and you can see why the archetype seems to get so much hate. Of course, even when shows do try to create situations where tsundere reactions are warranted, the progression of the relationship is always rather typical and never really tries to go beyond the usual fare. I'd still say, however, that we're still getting some quality tsundere characters here and there. One example is Karane Inda of the 100 Girlfriends who really love you. Now at first glance, Karane seems like exactly the kind of tsundere I just finished complaining about. The premise of this series being what it is, Karane is clearly meant to be a parodic pastiche of the tsundere character, one that hits all the classic traits and cliches without fail. However, you can't really leave her character at that. Yes, Karane is a pretty bog standard tsundere, but the series does go to the trouble of making it a part of her personality. Her tsundere tendencies are explained as being due to her being easily embarrassed and finding it hard to show her real emotions, and is something she actively struggles to push against. You only have to take a glance at season 2 to see that Karane being tsundere is more than just a trope for her to play up. It's an obstacle she's trying to break through, not a role she's stuck playing, and watching her overcome it is a part of her character's journey. There's a lot of tropey meta humor here, of course, but if you take that out, you still have a rather compelling character study. That's the one thing a lot of tsundere characters are missing, the fact that their tsundere traits are something to be overcome. Yeah, there's some appeal to the personality, but the end goal of any tsundere character is to see them overcome those traits to reveal their true feelings. Asuka never manages to reach this point. Karane is still doing her best to get there. I can't blame anyone for being annoyed when they see garden variety tsundere traits being exhibited, because if they're not there to be overcome, they're kind of just a waste of time. At the end of the day though, that's not enough to discount the entire archetype, and I hope that at the very least, people can acknowledge when the archetype is done well. Thanks for watching. I won't say people are wrong to dislike tsunderes if they rub them the wrong way, but I do think it gets a little overblown. Whether you like tsunderes or not, please leave a comment below with your thoughts on them. I'd love to hear it. Subscribe if you want to see more of my videos, and I'll see you next time.